Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the UFO, no, I want to say the podcast. Welcome to, well, maybe you should do it.
Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast that covers all weird and wild things in the world.
We talk about UFOs, winged humanoids, Bigfoot, you name it.
Whoa.
Mostly UFOs, though.
Winged humanoids. I can't wait to get to those.
Yeah, like Mothman. Been a bunch of those sighted in Illinois and Chicago here in the past few years. Around Michigan, Lake Michigan.
Don't know anything about it. That's going to be fun.
I am one of the hosts. My name's Steve.
And I'm the other host. My name's Jim.
Have you seen anything UFO related this week in the news or lately?
I saw the SpaceX thing. Do you want to talk about that?
No, go for it, man. You're much better at catching this UFO news than I am.
Yes,
what I'm looking at right now is a possum under a blanket licking what looks to be like ice cream.
Well, I'm glad your mind's in the right place.
Like one of those brown mules. That's what it looks like. Yeah. I'm serious. I'm not joking here. It's possum. I'm watching it eat. I mean, the thing is I had it on a video earlier, just a few minutes ago, about the SpaceX launch and all that stuff. But the news video, I'm watching a possum
lick itself.
No, it looks like it's eating. I don't think it's an eye, but it looks like a brown mule. Okay, it went to something else. So. That was totally distracting, man.
Just
totally
a little bit. So yeah.
It's not every day you get to see a possum eat I think it's a donut, chocolate covered donut.
So back to news in space.
Don't we talk about UFOs on this podcast or something like that?
Right. The SpaceX capsule that just recently went up almost hit a UFO. And it wasn't a possum licking itself. It was
the possum was eating something. It was not licking itself.
Yeah. So something they almost hit and they didn't. It was some UFO. I think a space debris. And they about 12 minutes into the flight, and they had to put their pressurized suits on just to be safe. Don't they already have those on? They don't have to get them on like Bruce Willis in Armageddon or something, right?
I think I'm not certain, but I think they wear the pressure suits, but they don't don the helmet and
right.
Put the helmet on and all that stuff and pressurize the suit. And you're right. It was an unknown object, and they said it passed within something like 28 miles of the capsule, and they were just told about it, told to pressurize their spacesuits as a precaution. In case
Tighten your sphincters. There's nothing we can do at this point.
Yeah, they said it wasn't enough time to maneuver. So
just something floating around in our atmosphere along with all the rest of the junk up there. Thank you, China, for hitting that satellite with your missile.
Yeah.
Another story for another day.
Now you had something though, right?
Oh, yeah. For all of you football fans out there, Baker Mayfield, his off-season activities apparently includes UFOs and Sasquatch because he's a fan. And,
hell yeah.
And on his way home to have dinner with his wife, Emily, on March the 4th in Austin, he apparently saw a UFO. And he's doubling down on it. He's not backing away from it, even though he's getting crap from others like Tampa Buccaneers Tom Brady. He didn't care. And let me tell you, if I was in an elevator with him and he brought up a UFO story, I wouldn't make fun of him. No. I think I'm about the size of his thigh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's that. You wouldn't want to make fun of him about anything, but I would be fascinated to hear the story,
Definitely.
Let's get him on the show, man.
Yeah.
Tell us about your UFO.
Hey, Baker. You want to come on this show and talk a little football and then also talk a little UFOs? We're your guys.
Yeah. So we're rolling into episode 3. And once again, what we hope, we're going to build a community of listeners and people that want to share with us their encounters. If you have any kind of encounter, it doesn't have to be a UFO. It could be Bigfoot. It can be Grinning Man. It can be Shimmer Man, Dog Man, Mothman, Spaceman. It doesn't matter to us. We would love to hear about your unusual encounter. It can be ghosts or anything. Email the show. It is firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. And we don't have to use your name. If you want to remain anonymous, just we'll use maybe the first letter of your name or something like that. But would like to know maybe where you're from so that we can put that into it. And, if it's a good sighting, we'll most definitely want to read them on the show and share it with everyone else.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
And I think I think it helps some people to get it off their chest, tell somebody, and then we can talk about it on the show. So we would love to have a conversation with you about it. Again, you remain totally anonymous. On this show, one thing we have talked about is trying to get to the truth of UFOs. UFOs exist. We know that they are real. The government has admitted the UFOs are real based on the 3 Navy videos that have just been, were released a few years ago, but actually officially released by the Pentagon in 2020. One issue I have with the subject of UFOs, where maybe the conversation is or the community is that we have all of these conspiracy theories. We have a lot of way beyond UFOs, especially the government cover up and some of that kind of things. I don't know what's true. I know there is some degree of government cover up. Jimmy and I have both been poring over all kinds of declassified documents. I mean, that's something I've been doing specifically, trying to read, and it's very interesting reading. A lot of UFO researchers through the years have filed countless FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests. It's very interesting, the stuff that's been declassified, to see that UFOs were being taken very seriously by our government and that a lot of this information was classified. But I think to understand where we are right now in the UFO world, when you see these shows and you see all this kind of stuff, and to understand kind of where the common thought process is if you're a UFO believer, I think you have to go back to the beginning and you have to look at where everything started. And so what I want to do, at least take 2 episodes and do the history of UFOs declassified. And the reason I call it declassified is I want to base this report or these shows coming up on the documents that I have read that are declassified. This is going to basically focus on the government's reaction to UFOs. So we'll bring up a few cases. We're not going to dive into them in depth because some of them are much too big to dive into in depth, but we may cover them briefly just to know the results and then what the government and the public's reaction was to them. So I want to get started with this thing. Jimmy, does that sound good to you?
That sounds perfect to me.
So as I said, to understand how we got where we are now with regards to UFOs, you have to go back to the beginning. The United States in 1947 was the only nuclear-armed superpower in the world. And along with their allies, they defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during the most catastrophic event in human history, and that was World War II. Over 50 million people are believed to have died during World War II. And of course, it climaxed in August of 1945 when the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, devastating the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it finally brought this horrifying conflict to an end. Now, although the communist nation of the Soviet Union was an ally during the war, the United States and other Western allies grew suspicious of them based on their post-war handling of Poland in particular and some of the other countries that they occupied as, they pushed the Germans back. So they ended up occupying all of the countries east of Germany. And one in particular, which was Poland, Polish government was in exile. But once Stalin was in there, they inserted their own government, a communist-friendly government there, and literally either imprisoned or executed many people that could pose a threat to the communist regime, and not just in Poland, but some of the other countries. So once this happened, Winston Churchill had made the comment that an iron curtain had descended between the Soviets and the Western Allies. Diplomatic relations broke down, and then began the Cold War. And I know I'm going into a lot of history here, but I think it's important to understand the backdrop of when the UFO phenomena began, where the United States was, where the United States government sat. So the Western Allies and Eastern Bloc countries began a military standoff that would last for another 46 years until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The United States and the Soviet Union remained in a war readiness posture that would allow either country to react to an invasion at a moment's notice. Of course, in 1947, we were the only one with atomic weapons, but the Soviets soon had them. So during the entire Cold War, we both were ready to go to war. We had bombers literally loaded, some in the air, ready to fly into the Soviet Union and start bombing them with nuclear weapons and to start a war that would end civilization as we know it. This is the backdrop of our UFO story.
It's good to know things have changed.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, that Jimmy and I grew up at the tail end. I'm a tail end of a baby boomer here. Okay, telling my age a little bit, but I remember it. I remember growing up at the end of the Cold War. So,
oh, I remember it too. I'm not much younger than you.
I know it. I can remember literally talking to my friends as we were kids, thinking at any moment, missiles could hit us and nuclear devastation that everyone could literally die in 10 minutes. I mean, that's literally how we were in those days.
Hey, just as an aside, did you ever watch that little video that had you curl up underneath your desk in case of a nuclear war? It's like,
oh my God, it's like the little turtle.
Yeah,
that
was
out
turtle
in the 50s. Yeah, that was called Duck and Cover. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were teaching school kids that if there was a flash, to jump under their desk and cover. But quite frankly, they did away. And then, of course, they had all the fallout shelters and all this kind of stuff in the 50s. But the nuclear weapons became so devastating, they didn't bother anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, a typical one ICBM was about 100 times more powerful than the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. Yeah. I mean, and that was just one. And we had hundreds of them, if not thousands of them, pointed at each other. Bombers loaded with, nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs.
Yeah. I just imagine you run to your bunkers so that the Morlocks in the future will find your skeleton clutching a can of beans in your fallout shelter and wonder what happened here.
Yeah. So, although World War II had ended, military spending remained a top priority with both countries, looking for weapon systems that would give them the edge over over the other one in case a conflict started. Secrecy also became very important. The Soviets tested their own atomic weapon in 1949. This was years before anyone thought they would have the capability to do so. It turned out that Joseph Stalin, and of course, that's the communist leader or dictator of the Soviet Union at the time, Stalin had a network of spies that had penetrated Los Alamos, the top secret lab in New Mexico that, of course, was our, nuclear weapons lab. That's where they learned to build the bombs. And the spies, gave all of the secrets to the Soviets. That's why they were able to accelerate their program pretty quickly. And I think it's important to note that, I don't know if you know this or not, but did you know that a lot of those spies didn't really take money or anything? I mean, they were American citizens who just were communists, had communist sympathies. And so, I mean, in the 1930s, communism was a popular wave. I mean, it was a popular front. And in the 1940s. So some of these people felt that the United States shouldn't be the only country in the world to have atomic weapons. And they literally leaked some of these weapons out because they were communists. And what that led to was the anti-communism stand that our government took. All of this propaganda and everything in anti-communism. And in the 1950s, what became known as the McCarthy era, where movie directors in Hollywood were blackballed and writers were blackballed and things like that, where they said that, of course, they looked at their work as being, they were looked at as communist sympathizers, as they were called. Our government was very paranoid about internal communists that would help the Soviet Union in some kind of or some type of conflict. And keep in mind, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was created internally. And it was because, the people rose up and replaced the government. And that's because they controlled a lot of newspapers and they controlled a lot of news outlets. That's how they got the word out to the people, saying, hey, communism's good. This capitalism stuff's no good. Let's replace the government. So the people in power, our people, the capitalists, our government, obviously didn't want that to happen. So that's the backdrop. And that's the thing that I want everyone to understand, because maybe we have some younger listeners that just don't have a good sense of history. of how the Cold War affected the thinking of the people in our government. In June of 1947, a private pilot was flying his plane near Mount Rainier in Washington State when he saw something. That pilot's name is Kenneth Arnold. In his own words, this is what happened.
And this afternoon, we are honored indeed to have here in our studio this man, Kenneth Arnold, who we believe may be able to give us a first-hand account and give you the same on what happened.
I was approximately 25 to 28 miles from Mount Rainier. I climbed back up to 9,200 feet, and I noticed to the left of me a chain which looked to me like the tail of a Chinese kite, kind of weaving and going at a terrific speed across the face of Mount Rainier. I at first thought they were geese because it flew like geese, but it was going so fast that I immediately changed my mind and decided it was a bunch of new jet planes in formation. As the planes come to the edge of Mount Rainier, flying at about 160 degrees south, I just thought I'd see just how fast they were going. They seemed to flip and flash in the sun just like a mirror. And in fact, I happened to be at an angle from the sun that seemed to hit the tops of these peculiar-looking things in such a way that it almost blinded you when you looked at them through your plexiglass windshield. It was about 1 minute to 3. I started clocking them on my sweep second-hand clock. As I kept looking at them, I kept looking for their tails. They didn't have any tails. I thought, well, maybe something's wrong with my eyes. And I turns the plane around and opens the window and looks out the window, and sure enough, I couldn't find any tails on them. The whole observation of these particular ships didn't last more than about 2.5 minutes, and I could see them only plainly when they seemed to tip their wing or whatever it was, and the sun flashed on them. They looked something like a pie plate that was cut in half with a sort of a convex triangle in the rear. Now, I thought, well, that maybe they're jet planes with just the tails painted green or brown or something. They didn't fly in a conventional formation that's taught in our Army. They seemed to kind of weave in and out right above the mountaintops. When I observed the tail end of the last one passing Mount Adams, and I was at an angle near Mount Rainier from it, but I looked at my watch, and it showed 1 minute and 42 seconds. Well, I still thought, well, that's pretty fast, and I didn't stop to think what the distance was between the two mountains. Well, I landed at Yakima, Washington. I began looking at my map and taking measurements on it, and the best calculation I could figure out, now even in spite of error, would be around 1,200 miles an hour, because making the distance from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams in, we'll say, approximately 2 minutes, it's almost, it'd be around 25 miles per minute. Now, allowing for error, we can give them 3 minutes or 4 minutes to make it, and they're still going more than 800 miles an hour, and to my knowledge, there isn't anything that I read about outside of some of the German rockets that would go that fast. These were flying in more or less a level, constant altitude. They weren't going up and they weren't going down. But to the best of my knowledge and the best of my description, that is what I actually saw, and like I told the Associated Press, I'd be glad to confirm it with my hands on a Bible, because I did see it, and whether it has anything to do with our Army or our intelligence or whether it has to do with some foreign country, I don't know. It's just as much a mystery to me as it is to everyone else who's been calling me the last 24 hours wondering what it was.
On June 24th, 1947, there was a private pilot. His name is Kenneth Arnold, and he claimed at the time to see 9 shiny, unidentified flying objects flying near Mount Rainier. What was he, like a fighting equipment salesman, and he used to fly his call air in the Pacific Northwest to all of his customers. He took a slight detour because there was a C-46 military aircraft that had gone down near Mount Rainier, and he was looking to help find it. I think they paid something like $5,000 for information of how to get there, which I think is probably worth about $50,000 or $60,000 today.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't have any luck finding it, and about the time he turned toward home, he noticed the bright flash, and that's when he saw these very fast-moving metallic objects. Now, oddly enough, he didn't actually say they were round or that they were flying saucers or flying discs. That came later as he described it to the press. At first, he looked out of his cockpit windshield. He saw it and he thought, well, maybe it's a strange reflection or something. So he actually opened his window and looked out into the air to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. Now, he said they flew in formation, but they flew very erratically, like up and down, left and right, but we're kind of in a formation. He said he had a good fix on Mount Rainier and one of the other smaller mountains near it and timed them, and he actually clocked them at about 18,000 miles per hour. Now, this was at a time when we had no airplanes that could break the sound barrier. The sound barrier had been broken a handful of times by Chuck Yeager and some other test pilots in the Bell X-1 rocket plane, but there was no jet aircraft that anyone had that could go even close to that fast.
Right. So the way that he actually clocked them, that's pretty interesting too, right? Because he didn't know when he took his measurements how fast they were going at that point in time. He calculated it later. Right?
He timed them between the two peaks of these mountains as they went behind him. And then later on, now he estimated they were going 18,000 miles per hour. But he actually told the press that they were going 1,200 miles an hour because he thought that nobody would believe that they were going 1,800 miles an hour.
1,800, that's right. And he actually said that he went with a super conservative estimate of 800 miles an hour.
Yeah, but I do see, just pulling it up here, the Chicago Sun on June 26, 1947, it shows that it says speed estimated at 1,200 miles per hour when seen at 10,000 feet near Mount Rainier.
So when you go a certain speed at a certain altitude at a certain air density, you create a sonic boom. What speed is that? It's like 750 miles an hour, something like that?
Yeah, around 700 miles an hour, and it does depend on atmospheric density.
Right.
So it's a little over 700 miles per hour. And this sonic boom, the shock waves cause, from the pressure building up on the wings. And then looks very strange. Have you ever seen like a Navy plane or an Air Force plane break the sound barrier?
Yeah.
It looks like they're going through some kind of portal or something.
It's cool.
So, and it's basically a shock wave. But of course, now, if they were already flying supersonic and he spotted them, there wouldn't be a sonic boom. It doesn't keep booming.
Right. Here's a question I have for you though. Were they flying level the whole time, horizontal the whole time, or did they drop down and come back up?
From what I understand, they looked like they had a destination and were going somewhere. They did change altitude up and down, but they remained basically in a level formation. The craft were jittery, like going up and down, up and down, up and down, and left to right. Like they were sort of flying in a formation and all going the same way, but they were kind of erratic in their movements. But they didn't drop altitude or climb altitude or anything. They just disappeared in the mountains. Whenever Kenneth Arnold returned to the airport, he tried to tell a few people about it. Most people didn't believe him. But within a few days, people got word and it exploded. The word about flying saucers or this unknown aircraft traveled around the world once it hit the newswire. Now, interestingly enough, his actually was not the first sighting, but it was the first sighting that got everyone excited. That's when the whole world sort of heard about this one thing, about these flying discs or flying aircraft that nobody knows what it is that's traveling very quickly. Now, Jimmy, I think you had looked up a couple of cases, right, that had come in before Kenneth Arnold.
Yeah, so in April of 1947, a Weather Bureau observer at the Richmond station observed on 3 different occasions during a 6-month period prior to April of 1947, a disc-like metal chrome object. All the sightings were made through a theodolite. Do you know what that is? Theodolite. It's when the guys are out doing surveys of your property, it sort of looks like that. And apparently weather balloon observers or people who are doing research with weather balloons, which was the case here, they'll use those to get range and bearing on weather balloons. I don't even know how to say it. Of course, I've been drinking, so theodolite. I'm going with that. While making these Pibal, P-I-B-A-L, balloon observations, so basically weather balloons. They recorded the sighting. The balloon was at 50.
Back up and say they were making observations using.
I like all of this. This is all good, man. It's all good. So
okay.
So the last reported sighting of the ones he had made up to April, I guess, was at 15,000 feet. The disc followed the balloon for 15 seconds. It was shaped like an ellipse with a flat, level bottom and a dome-like top. The altitude and speed were not estimated, but the object allegedly, through the instrumentation, appeared larger than the balloon. I don't know if we have a size of what the balloon was at that time, but it's a weather balloon, so it's pretty large, probably 40 feet, something like that. Another observer at the same station saw a similar object under corresponding circumstances. The balloon at that time was at an altitude of 27,000 feet and was reported to be pretty much similar. So a dual metallic luster in this case, not quite as shiny, and there was good visibility on both days. The reports, though, weren't submitted until the 22nd of July in 1947.
Okay, so that would have been well after the Arnold sighting. But, of course, we do know of Foo Fighters during World War II, both Allied and Axis-powered pilots saw these orbs that would pace with the formations. They would zip in and out of the formations. Both sides thought it was some secret weapon developed from the other side, and they become known as Foo Fighters. But that is one thing, of course, that most everybody's heard of. Anyway, interestingly enough, Kenneth Arnold described them as crescent-shaped, and it wasn't until a few days later, because he was being asked how the motion was of the objects, and he said it looked as if you were skipping a saucer on the surface of the water. And that was, I think he meant kind of the wobbly or the shimmery way that they traveled. And that is actually where flying saucers came from. And nobody apparently knows exactly which newspaper said it first. That just became a thing. Flying saucers, and then, of course, flying discs. You know, there's some details about how he estimated the size, and it sounds pretty complicated, the kind of things he did to gauge it based on what he knew a DC-4, the size of it was, but he estimated them to be about 60 feet in diameter. Once the press got a hold of it, this went all the way around the world, and then all of a sudden things just exploded. Everyone was seeing flying saucers.
Yeah, so I have a question about this. Everybody's seeing flying saucers. Now, what they're seeing, what they're describing they see is, you know, that classical flying saucer shape you see in those old B-rated movies from the day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what Kenneth Arnold saw. So do you think a lot of people are just making it up? Or they see lights in the sky and they say, I can't make it out, but it must be one of these flying saucers?
No, I totally agree with you. But there have been a lot of good, solid sightings of saucer-shaped craft. I mean, we have photographic evidence, we have film evidence, video evidence, mostly the disc-shaped. I mean, there's some other shapes out there as well. And I've always thought about that, too, because he said it was more crescent-shaped. And if you look at the drawings he makes, which, of course, we're audio medium here, they're round, very round in the front, and then kind of go at a V shape in the back, in a way, is the way he drew them out. But after that, I think because of the flying saucer thing, people said, hey, we found flying saucers. But the round, domed, top classics flying saucer, most definitely, especially in this era, was the predominant sighting. So I don't know how to explain that discrepancy. And, of course, there's been a lot of debunkers come out and say that he probably saw pelicans flying over the mountains, which would have been pretty speedy pelicans based on the way he, as he timed. And he said they can be quite reflective in the sun because the visibility also was clear and perfect that day. And, of course, there's the mountain mirages. You can see mirages when snow-capped mountains can look like things in the sky. Just it's a reflection of the snow. It's an atmospheric effect. And there were a lot of things like that. And, of course, there was one of the airline pilots in the area.
Yeah, so he wasn't the only one to see strange objects in the sky that particular day. It was seen in various places throughout Washington State, not just around Mount Rainier.
Yeah, that's right. There was some sightings from the ground as well. And, of course, they did come in after the fact.
Some actually came in before. They started at 11 o'clock in the morning. Kenneth Arnold's was around 2 o'clock p.m., and then they went all the way to 11 o'clock at night. I think there was a total of, at least in the time frame I saw, a total of about 6 sightings, which, I found that pretty interesting. And the way he describes it's really good. We should probably put him on with a little clip we have so we can have him give his description of the events that occurred, and he does a really good job of explaining the shape of the crafts as he saw them.
So as we were saying, there was some corroboration on the ground. This story takes off. There's tons of sightings all over the country. There's a huge UFO wave, or some mundane, or some of them unidentified aircraft where people just looked up and said, hey, I bet it's one of those flying saucer things. Not to mention, this is the time whenever weather balloons and atmospheric balloons and all these high-flying balloons were king. And so there's no doubt a lot of people who were unfamiliar with that type of aircraft or that type of technology, I'm sure, mistook some of those for flying saucers. There's no doubt about it. But regardless of that, there were some very, very good sightings, very good witnesses. Now let's move on to July 8th. So this is just a couple of weeks after Kenneth Arnold's sighting. And what we have is the Roswell thing, right?
Roswell. Yeah, well, Roswell is an interesting case. I don't know that a lot of people know about it. There's only been like a handful of television shows about it.
You ever heard about Roswell?
I heard about that TV show Roswell. You ever watch it? There's been two of them.
No. Well, the second one was really lame.
So you did see
like
it?
Teenage kids. Well, I watched one episode because I thought it might be something cool.
The second one isn't teenage kids. The second one's college kids, ex-college kids, because one of them's a biologist.
What is it with all these TV shows that have like high school kids and, they go to school even though they're like aliens and they're whatever? It's like, what is it? The vampire one?
There's like 20 of them, right?
Well, my wife loves Twilight. And I mean, I don't care. It's like when it's on, she's watching it.
I've never seen it.
Yeah. Anyway, it's
I've not seen it.
I mean, it's
I
like
know what it is.
Supposed to be, no spoiler alert, but the vampire's supposed to be like 150 years old or something. But when he shows up in town, what's he do? He goes to high school. Now, what kind of weirdo starts hitting on like a 16-year-old girl, and he's like 150, even though he looks like he's 16. So I don't know. Figure that one out.
So he's a rapist.
All right. Well, we digress. So let's go back to Roswell. There was a press release on July.
Hold up.
You going to make a drinking game?
Drinking game. Every time we say Roswell. Drink.
We should drink. Well, we could do that, or we could say every time we say flying saucer, and then people would really get hammered by the end of an episode.
Yeah, including me, and I don't think I can make it to the end of an episode if we're doing it every time we say flying saucer. Roswell's good.
So when you hear Roswell, you have to take a drink. Jimmy's taking another drink. All right. On July 8th, 1947, the Public Information Officer, Walter Haunt, issued a press release stating that personnel from the field's 509th Operations Group had recovered a flying disc which had crashed on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. The report was immediately picked up by numerous news outlets, and this thing went around the world like wildfire. But by the next day, General Ramey showed up, and they had the debris out there and had a lot of photographs taken and said, no, this is just a weather balloon. This is not a flying saucer. And for the most part, everybody believed it. It was right after World War II. Most people trusted the government. Sure, there was a handful of people that didn't believe it, but for the most part, the press forgot about it and the country forgot about it. Roswell would not become a thing for another 35 years. And we will most certainly talk about Roswell at some point very soon. I've been doing a lot of research on that particular topic. So we're in 1947. One big thing that happened was the signing of the National Security Act, which unified military, created the National Security Council, and also created the CIA. And by August, the sightings had dropped off some. Now, the press started paying a little less attention to it. The Army and a few, no big-time debunkers, but the Army and some scientists came out and said it's probably weather balloons, it's probably atmospheric conditions. And so the press started, simmering down a little bit. Plus, the sightings themselves had come down. And interestingly enough, Jimmy, I don't know if you knew this or not, but did you know that July, every year, July is the most popular month for UFO sightings? Even in the years that there's big UFO flaps, it's always in July.
I wonder why.
It's an interesting tidbit. I've thought about it some. I'm kind of like, it's July because more people are outside. It's summertime in the United States, but I don't know. But a statistic that it's a very well-known statistic.
Perhaps aliens like barbecues.
Maybe. But in the Pentagon, even though the subject of UFOs was starting to kind of be tampered down a little bit in the press, the Pentagon was pretty serious about it. They had something called the collections desk, where all of these reports were being collected so that if any agency or official wanted to look into it, they could read the reports. The Pentagon sent a request to Air Materials Command at Wright Field, which is now Wright-Patterson Airfield in Dayton, Ohio, and the Pentagon asked for an assessment of a possible incursions into U.S. airspace. And like I said, the Cold War was just getting underway, and many top Pentagon officials were actually concerned the flying discs could be of some kind of super secret Soviet weapon or aircraft that they had developed. And keep in mind, right after World War II, we captured some German scientists like Werner von Braun, who helped us with our rocket program. And
Operation Paperclip, baby.
And yeah, that's right. Operation Paperclip, where we got them into the country. So we kept a lot of their top scientists, and the Soviets also kept a lot of top German scientists. So we had no idea. And Germany, technologically, other than things like the atomic bomb, obviously, in some ways really had an edge technologically over the Allies in some regards, but not all. And that's debatable, and we could definitely go down that rabbit hole. But anyway, so they sent this request to Air Materials Command. The truth is there was no discussion that UFOs were extraterrestrial, even though some people in the press had said maybe from Mars or maybe from Venus. And this is the 1940s. We didn't know that Mars was inhabitable as we know today. And we didn't know that Venus was an uninhabitable hot box. People literally thought there was a chance that people or civilizations existed on our two nearest solar neighbors. And some people actually, not necessarily the Pentagon, but a lot of people also thought, okay, these objects, these discs we're seeing, they're ours. They're some top secret United States Air Force new plane, new thing that's being tested, and nobody knows about it. And they were waiting for it to be revealed that these were top secret U.S. aircraft. Of course, neither one was true. And so a few weeks after the request was sent to Wright Field, a Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, he was the commander of Air Force Materials Command at Wright Field, sent what is now a declassified document in response. Now, I've read the whole thing. Jimmy, I think you've read this memo as well. Of course, it's known as the Twining memo. Mm-hmm. And it goes into some other things, but the most important things are these. In it, he said, the phenomenon is real and not visionary or fictitious. The reported operating characteristics such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, particularly in roll, and motion, which must be considered evasive when sighting or contacted by friendly aircraft and radar, lend to the belief the possibility some of these objects are controlled either manually, automatically, or remotely. The report goes on to describe disc-shaped metallic objects as the most common, and it also recommends that a detailed study be conducted and reports made to all available branches of the military, as well as other security and intelligence agencies such as the CIA. So in December of that year, following Twining's advice, they set up Project Sign.
Now, what year was that?
This is still in 1947.
Okay.
This was December of 1947.
Gotcha.
So it's the same year, it's the end of the same year of Kenneth Arnold sighting.
Gotcha.
Even at this point, Twining is quoted somewhere really downplaying the seriousness of UFOs, but he's the one that actually made this memo, that it's a very serious problem and it's not some illusionary thing. These are real objects. These UFOs actually exist and we can't figure out how they work. So in December, following Twining's advice, they set up Project Sign. And it was based at Wright Air Force Base there in Dayton, Ohio. And they were tasked with investigating UFO sightings and making regular reports to the various government agencies to determine if there existed any threats to national security. I can probably look it up here. I've got a thing that has all of Project Signs and Project Grudge and Project Blue Book's
statistics
investigations.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1948, it looks as if, and this would have been the big year for them in maybe 1949, they investigated 156 sightings. In 1949, 186 sightings. They stated it's 7 were unidentified in 1948 and 22 in 1949 were unidentified. Now, there's a lot of cases here, but there are 3 that I think are very pertinent that I think we should cover briefly here. And like I said, one of these days we may do deep dives onto some of these and really dig into them. The first one I want to talk about is what's known as the Mantell incident. Jimmy, are you familiar with this case?
Yeah, Thomas Mantell was an Air National Guardsman. What was it, a single prop?
F-51 Mustang.
Oh, it was a Mustang. They were flying, and they got sight of this shiny object and went to go chase it. Mantell was the only one who went all in on it, and he reached an altitude. They believe he passed out, and then he crashed and died. I think subsequently the reports showed that what he ended up chasing, and they thought maybe Venus or something like that, but what they really thought he was chasing was a skyhook balloon.
Right. So, yeah, just to summarize that, so it was an F-51 Mustang. Now, you may be saying, hey, I thought that was called a P-51. Well, just so you understand, after World War II, they called all fighter aircraft F. They changed the designation, but it was exactly the same aircraft that helped us win World War II, known as a P-51 Mustang, and the P stood for pursuit. Just so you know, little useless World War II trivia for you there, aircraft trivia.
Nerd.
So, right, there were witnesses on the ground, and of course, that's the reason these aircraft were dispatched to start with, and that saw a large cone-shaped object flying very high and very slowly. The other pilots broke off and went back, and he said he wanted to get a closer look at it. They think he got up to 20,000 feet. Now, you got to think this is an unpressurized cockpit. I mean, we fly in commercial airliners today, and they are totally pressurized, and we can breathe and wear T-shirts and whatever. Most aircraft in that day was unpressurized, meaning they were exposed to the elements. And there's very, very little air up there. You get up to 20,000 feet, you can't breathe. You can barely breathe. So they thought that he probably, and it's very, very cold too, I might add. That's why all the bombers from B-17s in the day had those big heavy wool bomber jackets, because it's very cold. So they believed that he blanked out from a lack of oxygen, and his plane continued to increase in altitude and finally stalled at around 28 or 30,000 feet, and they estimate, and then it went into a tailspin and crashed. Now, the fact that this happened, of course, spread like wildfire. Here's a United States Air Force fighter aircraft chasing a UFO, and it crashes. So this once again became a very big case, and the news picked it up all over the world. Project Sign said that they believed that he was chasing the planet Venus, and that's what they put down as their official report. Now, you're absolutely right that years later, Project Blue Book actually went back and took another look at it, and they believed that it was a large, what was known as a skyhook balloon, which of course would have been a cone-shaped object. That's the official report that Blue Book came up with, that most likely they saw, because the problem is, again, with some of these balloons and things, they were top secret. A skyhook balloon that the Navy used was a top secret thing. Nobody had ever seen one. So you've heard about all these flying saucers and stuff, and it's cone shaped. That's probably what he saw. I'm sure there's some UFO true believers out there, but that's a pretty logical explanation, I think. But it was a big case, and of course it was something that Project Sign had to deal with right away, because this was in January. They were only formed in December. This happened on January 7th. Now, the second case that I think we should look at when looking at what Project Sign dealt with was known as the Gorman dogfight. Have you heard about this one?
No, this is going to be new for me. The Gorman dogfight.
Right.
So was it dogs fighting like chihuahuas or dachshunds?
So you know what a dogfight is, a fight between two aircraft. So over Fargo, North Dakota, this was...
Wait a minute. You're talking a dogfight with two fighter prop planes?
So George F. Gorman, a veteran fighter pilot of World War II, on October 1st, 1948, over Fargo, North Dakota, had actually been out on a training mission or a patrol or something with some other planes, and everybody else went in and landed. He decided he was going to fly a little bit more. I'm not really sure why, but he was all by his lonesome. He had noticed that there was a Piper Cub. He, I think, flew over the local football field. And he said shortly after he noticed the Piper Cub that was flying close to the football stadium, that he...
Wait a minute. What's a Piper Cub?
Piper Cub's just a small civilian aircraft. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not into avionics and airplanes and stuff like you, man.
Yeah.
I'm thinking another dog of this fight.
So shortly after he noticed this Piper Cub, Gorman saw another object to the west. And when he looked for an outline of a wing or a fuselage, he saw nothing. It was contrasted with the Piper Cub where he could see everything. So even though it was dark, visibility was clear. The object appeared to be a blinking light, and at 9:07, Gorman contacted the control tower at Hector Airport and asked if they had any air traffic over the area other than his P-51 Mustang or F-51 Mustang and the Piper Cub. The tower said it didn't, so at this point he decided to chase it. On October 23rd, after this incident, Gorman gave a sworn account of the incident. I'm going to read it to you here. His statement was reprinted for decades after, and of course in numerous books and documentaries about UFOs. But his statement says, "I'm convinced that there was a definite thought behind its maneuvers. I'm further convinced that the object was governed by the laws of inertia because its acceleration was rapid but not immediate. And although it was able to turn fairly tight at considerable speed, it still followed a natural curve. When I attempted to turn with the object, I blacked out temporarily due to excessive speed. I'm fairly good physical condition, and I do not believe that there were many, if any, pilots that could withstand the turn in speed affected by the object and remain conscious. The object was not only able to outturn and outspeed my aircraft, but was able to attain a far steeper climb and was able to maintain a constant rate of climb far in excess of my aircraft." So he gets in somewhat of a dogfight with this with this flying saucer. Within a few hours, Project Sign shows up, and of course they question him and everything. And also, I think the Piper Cub had spotted this object as well. The initial conclusion was that something remarkable is to Gorman in the skies over Fargo. Now, that's according to a UFO reporter.
And you thought the Dakotas were strange. They're stranger even more so.
Oh, here's something important, too. They checked his airplane for radiation, and it emitted extra radiation with a Geiger counter.
More than expected?
More than expected. But then whenever Sign got there and some people started investigating this stuff, they said that a plane flying high in Earth's atmosphere is less shielded from radiation than at ground level. Thus, the Geiger counter readings were considered invalid evidence for stating the lighted object was atomic powered. The Air Weather Service revealed that on October 1st, it had released a lighted weather balloon from Fargo, and that the balloon would have most likely been in the area that Gorman and the Piper Cub passengers first saw the lighted object. Project Sign's investigator also believed that the incredible movements of the object were due to Gorman's own maneuvers as he chased the light around in the sky, and that the object's maneuvers were an illusion brought about by the movements of the Gorman's fighter. The investigators also believed that as the weather balloon passed out of sight, Gorman had come to believe that the planet Jupiter was the UFO, and therefore he had been chasing the planet as he flew south of Fargo before giving up and returning to land. By early 1949, the Gorman case was labeled by Project Sign and its successors, Project Grudge and Project Blue Book, as being caused by a lighted weather balloon. But anyway, at the time, and it took a while to get to that, they considered that to be a pretty extraordinary account. Now, the only problem I have with that is that the man was only 25 years old, but he was a veteran of World War II, and he had many, many hours in a P-51. That wasn't a slacker aircraft at the time. The only thing that could outperform it would have been a jet aircraft.
Maybe he was an excitable sort of fellow.
He might have been, but I still find it odd that he would have just been chasing a floating weather balloon around and wouldn't know what it was, a lighted weather balloon.
Well, perhaps he elaborated and put a little bit more into his story than what was real.
I mean, he's talking about making these tight turns and the craft making these tight turns. I mean, he was obviously chasing the thing, right?
Not obviously. I mean, he could have not been telling the truth. He could have just been crafting a story for the ladies.
Well, there is that. So let's move on. That was another case that, at the time anyway, Project Sign, before they kind of went back and looked at it again and explored things, looked at as being pretty significant. Now, the third case, and this is the big one. Uh-oh. This is the Charles Whited encounter. Are you familiar with this one?
No, it doesn't sound familiar. You have to fill me in.
This is the one where the DC-3 airliner was passed up by an object to its starboard side. You know the one I'm talking? You don't know the one I'm talking about?
It's not ringing a bell. Is it the one where all of the pilot, co-pilot, and other people on the plane saw it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 It was the early morning hours of July 24th, 1948. Clarence Childs, chief pilot, John Whitted, was the co-pilot on an Eastern Airlines Douglas DC-3.
Oh,
Now,
yeah, I remember this now. Yeah.
if you don't know what a DC-3 is, it's just a twin-engine, propeller-driven aircraft. They were known as a C-47 in World War II, and it's the one the paratroopers dropped out of. So if you've ever seen a World War II movie where American paratroopers are jumping out, that's a DC-3, but the military designation is a C-47. Around 2:45 a.m., Childs saw a dull red glow above and ahead of the aircraft. He told Whitted, "Look, here comes my new Army jet job," because they thought they were being passed up by an Army jet. In a matter of seconds, both men later said that the object flew past the right side of their plane at high speed before it pulled up with a tremendous burst of flame out of its rear and zoomed up into the clouds. They observed the object for a total of 10 to 15 seconds. Now, what was strange about this object, it was torpedo-shaped, or some people say cigar-shaped. It had 2 rows of windows, as if it was a double-decker, let's say. Now, both men described the same thing and drew practically the same thing. Oddly, it had some type of exhaust, flame shooting out of the end of it. Both pilots claimed the object was around 100 feet long and about 20 to 30 feet in diameter, similar to a B-29 fuselage, but without the wings, and it had flames coming out of the tail. Only one of the passengers saw anything unusual, and he reported seeing a bright streak of light that flashed by his window. Now, these 2 pilots, when they landed, they reported this to Project Sign, and Project Sign investigators were very impressed by the detailed report that both men had. And one very important aspect is they estimated that this craft passed their aircraft, which is probably cruising at like 250 miles an hour, maybe 300. I don't know, probably more like 200 to 250. Again, these aircraft weren't speedy, but they estimated that this craft had zoomed past them at about 700 to 800 miles an hour. That would have been almost unheard of performance, even if the craft had wings. But the big issue here was that the craft didn't have any wings. So where's the lift? You can go fast in an airplane, but you need wings to, create lift. So the air, comes up under the wings. But this thing had no wings and was torpedo shaped, had flames shooting out of the side and shot past the ship. Project Sign, the investigators realized that the only way this thing could have flew, it would had to have had a tremendous energy source of some type of power plant that could allow this craft to even fly like that. And the only thing they could think of that technologically existed at the time, of course, was nuclear. Now, again, this is 1948. Nobody else has nuclear power. No one else has nuclear weapons in the world other than the United States. And they knew the United States didn't have anything like that. So this case is the one that they chalked up as likely extraterrestrial.
Really?
Yes, based on all of the witness testimony, the very detailed reports that individually both pilots made and had corroborated so much on also of the details, especially having 2 layers of windows, the shape of the craft, the estimated speed, all of those things.
Not a meteor.
Well, oddly enough, now later on, there, of course, was some skeptics that came forward later. There was an astronomer from Harvard.
Donald Menzel.
Yeah, the astronomer from Harvard. Mm-hmm. And he was probably the first big UFO skeptic to come out. He said that it was probably a meteor that was flying essentially horizontally through the Earth's atmosphere.
Because they do that, right?
They do that from time to time. And apparently that had happened to another pilot that was able to identify it as a meteor in another situation. However, why did both men have described the craft the same way? Why did both men say looked like an aircraft fuselage without any wings and had 2 rows of windows?
Maybe they had gambling debts and they needed a story where they could make some bank.
Could be, but regardless of all that, Project Sign looked at this as being, this really was the one sighting that changed things for them. Because at the time, the Project Sign team were divided. There was some that believed in the reports that these were extraterrestrial craft. They were like, there's no way. We have these very multiple witness reports. They didn't have photographic evidence, but just based on what people were seeing, the similarities of what everyone was seeing, go to one sighting in North Dakota, go to another sighting in Virginia, and they're basically describing the same thing. Of course, most were explained away. But this one incident and the way it was described by the witnesses really pushed the sign team to believe that there was a small minority of these craft and that were extraterrestrial, and that Earth was being visited by
Buck Rogers
aliens or something, right?
It sounds like a rocket ship from Buck Rogers.
It does. And you know what? I thought of that too, how interesting that is. That is something that those guys may have recognized as a science fiction thing in that era. I've thought about that too.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems odd to me. I don't know where to file that in my brain, but it did occur to me. That sounds like a Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers spacecraft from the old serials of the 1920s and 30s. Project Sign put together this massive report, and they turned it in, and it started making its rounds in the Pentagon. And although they determined that most sightings could be attributed to mundane explanations, the Sign team left open the possibility that some UFOs were interplanetary spacecraft. Now, this became known later as the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH. So if you ever see ETH, that's what it means, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The report finally reached the chief of staff of the newly created Air Force, General Hoyt Vandenberg, and he said there's absolutely no physical evidence to support this extraterrestrial claim. It was obvious that this was not a message he wanted to send out to the general public or even to the military. And he definitely didn't want to go to President Truman with this and say, hey, you know what? Some of them are UFOs and our Air Force can't do jack about it. We can't do anything to control these.
So instead, he's chewing on his cigar and he's saying, knock that shit off.
You're probably thinking of Curtis LeMay, the cigar chomper.
I don't know who that is.
Oh my God, dude, you need to read a history book.
They're so thick and they got so many words.
So not only did he order all copies of this report destroyed, but he also completely disbanded Project Sign, and he replaced them with a new team called Project Grudge. Now, Project Grudge could also be known as AKA Flying Saucers Ain't Real Team.
Knock that shit off.
So Project Grudge, and they say that the project was named purposefully Grudge because of the report that Sign had turned in to General Vandenberg. Maybe weren't ordered to debunk all UFO sightings, but they had seen what had happened to Project Sign and was completely disbanded. Now, it's important to note that J. Allen Hynek, who becomes very prominent later, was a consultant for the Air Force. He actually worked on Project Sign and Project Grudge, and of course later in Project Blue Book. And I'm actually reading his book that he published in 1973. It's a pretty interesting read, but he becomes much more prominent later on. So like I said, Project Grudge was known as Flying Saucers Aren't Real. And, incidentally, Project Sign was originally called Project Saucer, and they changed the name.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I found that somewhere. I have no idea where. My God, I've been doing so much research on this stuff. So it was announced that Grudge would take over where Sign had left off. Now, one thing that Project Grudge did was they put a lot more focus and emphasis on the witnesses themselves. And I know they came up with a way of categorizing witnesses. Like if it was a guy like regular Joe or a housewife or whatever, they totally disregarded that sighting. They're like, okay, they don't know what they're looking at. And they would only really seriously even consider, like if someone had military experience or was a pilot or something like that. But they really did work to discredit every single sighting. So it was run by Major Aaron J. Boggs, and also Colonel Harold Watson of Air Material Command were openly skeptical of flying saucers, and they thought the whole business was ridiculous. And they obviously thought that the whole thing needed to be put to bed. Now, Project Grudge only made one big report, or planned to only make one report, and kind of closed the book on UFOs because, in the Pentagon, there were people that, just like in anywhere, even today, there's people that think, hey, wait a minute, there's something to this. We need to investigate flying saucers or UFOs. And then there's the other people that just totally disregard it and say it's just a bunch of hogwash. And that was what was going on in the Pentagon. Project Grudge was most definitely used a debunking type directive. All UFO reports were judged to have some type of mundane explanation. And sometimes their explanations were very strained and even logically untenable. I mean, sometimes when you hear a UFO sighting and, someone stretches it or pushes it and says, hey, or connects the dots on a conspiracy and you think they're really pushing it. Well, Project Grudge really pushed some of their explanations for flying saucers and UFOs. Now, what happened? There's a couple of big events that were important in Project Grudge, just to understand that that's what was going on as far as the Air Force's investigation. But one thing they did, and again, they felt like the public needed to settle down a little bit on this whole UFO phenomenon. So they started a PR campaign, and the first salvo came whenever Sidney Shallot published an article in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a very popular magazine in those days. They did 2 consecutive issues in April 30th and May 7th, 1949. And they echoed the Grudge line that most UFOs could be easily explained. The phenomenon was mostly just misidentifications, and they all felt that the subject had been blown out of proportion by mass media. Now, Shallot suggested that hoaxes and crackpots played a prominent role in popularizing UFOs as well. Now, the truth is, and this is according to J. Allen Hynek's book, who was involved in Project Sign, Project Grudge, and of course, more famously in Project Blue Book. Most reports are not from crackpots. Most reports are not from drunks and wackos. Most reports are from everyday people, because I'm not going to say there's no crackpots, but that's just not true. So, but what was interesting about that article was they said there was a certain percentage, very, very small percentage, that were unexplained. Okay, now think about this article. It goes all through debunking. I mean, this is a 2-parter in this magazine, right? 2 consecutive months. And at the end, or somewhere in it, they say that there's only this really small percentage that are unexplained. The public grabbed on to the unexplained, that small percentage. I mean, it did absolutely nothing to quell the interest in UFOs by the general public. The whole article planted this seed of doubt in the Air Force. Like, hey, look, the Air Force is trying to cover it up, and that's why they're making this article. But there's, so
you're saying it's not zero,
right? So you're saying there's a chance.
Exactly.
Yeah. That was, of course, had exactly the opposite effect that Project Grudge wanted. So in August of 1949, Project Grudge issued its only formal report. It was over 600 pages long. But these are the highlights. In one part, it says, there's no evidence that objects reported upon are the result of an advanced scientific foreign development, and therefore they constitute no direct threat to national security. In view of this, it is recommended that the investigation and study of reports of unidentified flying objects be reduced in scope. Headquarters AMC Air Material Command will continue to investigate reports in which realistic technical applications are clearly indicated. And they said, it is apparent that further study along present lines would only confirm the findings presented herein. It is further recommended that the pertinent collection directives be revised to reflect the contemplated change in policy. All evidence and analysis indicate that reports of unidentified flying objects are the result of misinterpretation of various conventional objects, a mild form of mass hysteria and war nerves, individuals who fabricate such reports to perpetuate a hoax or to seek publicity, and psychopathological persons.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, that was Project Grudge's their final word on it. But they still existed even after this massive report was done. Now, J. Allen Hynek, who I mentioned before, and rose to much more prominence during Project Blue Book, he was involved with Grudge, and he actually wrote a recommendations section for this report. And he urged, now again, he was an astronomer. He was a university astronomer, had high security clearance. That's why he was recruited. And he urged that the Air Force should educate its personnel in just simple astronomical phenomena, and also recommended the authorization of continued scientific study of the investigation. So he was still interested.
Well, he's getting a paycheck, right? He's getting a paycheck. So he's like, keep paying me, man. Right?
Right. So anyway, he, I mean, you could look at it that way, but I know J. Allen Hynek, even though he was an open skeptic, he still thought, even way back in 1949, UFOs should be investigated. So not long after this report was released, it was reported that Grudge would soon be dissolved. Despite this announcement, Grudge wasn't quite finished. And they still kept a few personnel assigned to the project and basically help people debunk flying saucer sightings. You know, if they were asked, if the media called or asked or whatever, they would say, well, it was probably Venus, or it was probably a weather balloon, or whatever they normally say.
Right.
So everything came to a head with Project Grudge on September 10th, 1951. There was a radar visual UFO encounter. Now, what we mean by radar visual, and those are some of the best encounters you can ask for, because radar part means that it's being tracked on radar. Your UFO is being seen by our equipment. And then a visual means that someone else has seen it, actually laid eyes on the object. It can be a pilot, which it quite often is in these cases, or it can be people on the ground. There was a radar visual UFO encounter near Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. Pilots and radar operators reported encounters with a number of fast-moving, highly maneuverable disc-shaped aircraft. So as this was going on, there was some brass in the room. I think they were being shown the radar facilities whenever this event occurred. They ordered an investigation, and a Lieutenant Cummings and a Lieutenant Colonel Rosegarten spent most of September 13th interviewing witnesses and gathering documentation at Fort Monmouth. Now, the duo were ordered to report to Charles Cabell, who was then the head of Air Force intelligence at the Pentagon. Cummings and Rosegarten arrived at the meeting. It's already in progress. They found the atmosphere very thick with tension. Cabell, in particular, was very distressed by what he saw as sloppy debunking and lackluster attitude of Project Grudge. Project Grudge leaders and the people who ran the program just literally made fun of the witnesses. They didn't do a very good job filing anything, and they rarely actually investigated anything at all. So Cummings and Rosegarten gave their report. They judged that the fast-moving objects cited were being intelligently controlled based on the radar data and the interviews with the witnesses. Cummings asked General Cabell if he could speak freely, and he cut loose, and he said that every UFO report submitted to Grudge was taken as a huge joke, and that Project Grudge was a waste of time, that it wasn't investigating anything. When General Cabell learned about this, he became furious. In another meeting with some of the high-ranking military colonels, Cabell was said to have said, "I've been lied to and lied to and lied to. I want it to stop, and I want the answer to the saucers, and I want a good answer." And so Cabell completely dissolved Project Grudge, and that's the beginning of Project Blue Book.
Yeah, I think there's something important just to add to the story. So this is probably the first story I've heard. Now, there's probably earlier ones where there's actual radar data from military personnel. And it's not just that. So they observed this thing on radar traveling up the northeast coast at approximately 700 miles an hour is what they estimate this thing's traveling. Now, they also got eyewitness accounts of it from two more military men that were in a piloted jet. It was a Lieutenant Wilbert Rogers and a Major Edward Ballard Jr., who was in the rear seat. don't know what kind of plane they were flying or jet they were flying. Here we go. It's a T-33. You know what that is?
Mm-hmm. Training aircraft.
Yeah. So they're in this training aircraft, and they pursue it for 30 miles before they lose sight of it. And it's traveling at 900 miles, they estimate. Once it fell off the radar, these guys are still following it up, Sandy Hook. So it falls off the radar about somewhere around Sandy Hook, New Jersey, I guess that is. They're following this thing for 30 miles. And
yeah, I mean, they must have lost it if it was traveling at 900 miles an hour, because I can tell you a T-33 can't do that.
No, they lost it when it traveled in excess of 900 miles per hour. I guess so. They'd give chase for 30 miles. According to their estimates, it traveled in excess of 900 miles per hour. So I don't know at what point in time it took up to 900 miles per hour. Maybe they were exaggerating. They were traveling northward at an altitude of 20,000 feet over Point Pleasant, New Jersey, when they encountered the craft.
This was a very serious, observed radar visual sighting. I mean, there's little doubt what this is. It's not a freaking weather balloon. It's not Jupiter. It's not Venus.
It's not a balloon. It was traveling. It says their claim was, quote, it was banking left and was too fast to be a balloon.
Good point. So, so this is a very good case. These are the kind of sightings, the kind of incidents where you have all these multiple observers. You have the radar data. How could that be construed as everyone was mistaken? Now, I know that there's going to be skeptics, and I'm sure there were skeptics at the time that came over and said, well, they probably saw this, and it was an inversion. That's what they always say about the radar data. They always say it was a temperature inversion. I don't know if temperature inversions can travel at 900 miles an hour and look like a flying disc. It's a very good sighting. And this is what got General Cabell so excited and why he disbanded Project Grudge. They were so busy debunking every single sighting that they weren't really giving any kind of useful data to the military to try and get to the bottom of what flying saucers and UFOs are. So Project Grudge is out, and it's the beginning of Project Blue Book. They put a Captain Edward Ruppelt in charge. He is considered by just about any investigator as the most open-minded leader they ever had in Project Blue Book. It's sometimes called the golden era. But some things are going to happen in the very next year, because 1951, despite this very meaningful sighting, was a pretty slow year for UFOs. 1952 would prove to be a much different year. And we've been running very long with this, so I want to leave it here, and I want to pick up Project Blue Book and the things that happened in 1952, the UFO flap of 1952. And that, in a way, will answer many questions about where we are now and the military's general attitude toward UFOs and their stance.
Yeah, and it's this case out of Fort Monmouth,
I think. Monmouth. Monmouth. If you're from Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, or near, please tell us how to pronounce that.
We don't
right
know.
Into the show. First contact at CosmicSponge.com.
I had a good public school education. It's not their fault I can't speak.
That's going to be the show for this time. Like I said, we went kind of long with this. We've been doing a ton of research myself. I've been looking at I know this went very long and maybe a little more detail than you wanted, but I mean, I could have been 4 times as long. I've read so many declassified documents, and I mean, I find it fascinating.
Ditto. The stuff I didn't know.
Yeah. I hope listeners have learned something from all that. I know that while I was putting that report together, I definitely learned some things. We will be picking up with Project Blue Book and the big UFO 52 on the next episode. But before we go, I want to remind everyone to please leave us a review. We're a brand new show. And the more, especially positive reviews, if you like the show, please give us 5 stars, because the way these algorithms work, it helps bump it up. If somebody does a search on UFOs or mystery phenomena or something like that, we want our show to be able to kind of get up in the rankings so other people can find it. So if you like the show, please give us a rating. And again, please reach out to us. Even if you don't have an encounter that you want to talk about, reach out and just say hello. And that's first contact at CosmicSponge.com. This is something interesting. I meant to mention this at the first of the show, just real quick.
Yeah.
Have you ever just brought up the subject in say, a party or dinner or something like that? You ever brought up the subject of mystery phenomena or mysterious things?
No.
To people and see yeah, I found it very interesting. One time I was having dinner with a bunch of college friends, and they all lived out of town, and they had come into town for this dinner, and we all got together and old friends, hadn't seen each other for a long time, but there were a few people there that I didn't know that were just traveling with them and stuff, family members or something. I don't remember now exactly, but I brought up UFOs. And I brought up the subject and talked about it. And yeah, a couple people made jokes, and a couple of people, thought, wow, what a wacko, all that kind of stuff. But the funny thing was that people started talking about things they'd encountered. In fact, most people did. And I remember one woman, and I didn't know her because she was one of the people just traveling with this group of friends. And she talked about spending the night in an old house. And when she woke up the next morning, she saw a ghost of a little girl kneeling by the bedside, saying her prayers. And I thought that was a really neat encounter. Again, if you have encounters, no judgment here. We would love to hear it, and we'll share it on the show. So anyway, that's our show. You got anything else, Jimmy?
Nope, nothing else at all. That's a long show.
It's a long show.
I'm a little buzzed.
Yeah. I would like to add, I don't drink while I'm doing the show. Jimmy has to drink to get a little loosened up.
I do.
Anyway, next week, Project Blue Book, and we are out of here.
Later.